it's something that I've been asked about a few times because some of the students that I work with would like to do it, and maybe down the road. But I always like to make sure I have enough to teach it well before I start.
Okay, let's start with the weapons you teach, and we go one by one. Start with the earliest weapon you teach, please, Jim.
Oh, the earliest weapon I teach? Oh gosh, probably as I teach it, probably the earliest would be small sword. So another point weapon. They're very small, 30, 32 inches, and it's basically like a giant, quick, or small, I should say, quick, sharp needle. They're very quick. And, a lot of people like to make fun of it because it's from a period when, especially in Western Europe, men's fashion was rather fancy. And it lends itself well to those jokes, but it's a really effective weapon. And I like it because I think I can see the parallels between it, earlier rapier, and later modern fencing. Today's épée, if it's taught well, for example, has more in common with small sword, I think, than most people realize. In terms of closing the line, in terms of not having right of way, in terms of the danger to the forward target with such a small guard. And then, of course, it applies all the same rules of judgment and timing and measure. After that, probably the next thing I teach that's probably the oldest, because you could look like late 17th century for that. The rest is mostly 18th and 19th century. And my favorite thing to teach is saber. This is a lighter version, but this is one of the Radielli style sabers. And you'll notice it's got a very thin knuckle bow, and it has these sort of extra rings.
Yes.
Now, I think one of the things that's difficult about the Radiellian school is that it started out as a cavalry school. And so this style of saber has things in it that even on foot were originally developed for horse. And so, for example, in some modern systems, people rotate the cut at the wrist with the fingers a lot. And in Radiellian saber, we use the elbow. So it's a much bigger cut. And some of the texts, like Masiello's, actually has a cavalry manual. And he has the unmounted exercise where the men basically stand in what looks like horse stance. And they pretend they're on a horse, and they learn how to lean and in and out of the saddle. So it makes for a really complicated combination of very large cuts with slightly less big cuts, and then a couple of direct cuts, but normally from ripostes, as ripostes. Okay. And this is probably, I think this one is about 700 grams. So it's perfect per foot. And a lot of the saber, especially late period sabers, weren't much heavier than that for cavalry. Maybe 800, 900 tops. And in HEMA, they really like big, heavy sabers, really big. But if you can use this, you can use those.
And why do they use big, heavy sabers in HEMA?
I don't know. I think it's a macho thing, honestly. I think the problem is that such sabers exist, right? But if you have a 1,000-gram weapon that's forward weighted, it has very minimal guard, and it's very broad, it's clearly meant for the saddle. And you don't fence on horseback the way we do on foot. I mean, there's a romance about fighting in cavalry, but the truth is that, if it wasn't reconnaissance, then they were usually surprising somebody on the side or chasing them from behind. Some of the surviving pictures, and there are some medical pictures that survive of saber wounds, and it's not an accident that most of them are on the back of the head and the shoulders. That means these infantrymen were running away, and these guys were chasing them down, and that would be terrifying. I mean, you could see how that would be an effective weapon. But the idea that you're in the saddle, that doesn't follow. And so, using that heavy a saber, I don't know. I think it'd be really bad for your arm. And as somebody who has joint injuries, I can't do that. That's not to say that such sabers didn't exist, but I think was it Christopher Amberger who put an article together a long time ago on the average weight of sabers, and they're a lot lighter than most people think. On average, they're like 680 grams. I mean, they're not that heavy. And because of that, you're able to do more complicated actions. Now, on the battlefield, that might not matter, but for those officers that might have to fight a duel, it absolutely matters. And I think that's something we forget. You know, there's a difference between the guy who's lost his musket, lost his bayonet, and now has the sword facing who knows what, and somebody facing another person who may or may not know what they're doing one-on-one. It's a very different context.
It is, absolutely. What kind of other weapons do you teach, Jim?
I don't have one with me right now, but I do teach bayonet. And I've looked at 200 years worth probably of different drill manuals for that. My father taught me a little bit as well. That was one of the things he told me if I went into the military, I should make sure I know. And my dad's much older and I'm not even sure they're using them anymore, but they did when he was.
Yes.
And so that's been really fun for me because it's a modern polearm, right? And so some of the ways to look at partisan or, you know, spear or poleaxe, I see parallels there that are really interesting. And I also teach a little bit of insular broadsword, like Scottish and English broadsword. It's just another school of saber, and the basic principles are the same. Some of the responses are different. And so, you know, I've got, like, for example, here, this is Chris Holzman's translation of Del Frate's 1876 work. This is sort of the first Radielian text. And it was for both cavalry and for on foot. But then I'll have, like, this is, thank goodness for Google Books. This is a broadsword manual from 1804 by Rauworth. Well, there's several editions, but this is the 1804 edition from Rauworth, Charles Rauworth's The Art of Defense on Foot. And if you look at these texts side by side, there's a lot of overlap. There are some key differences too. You know, in the Italian texts, because the context was different, they might have tables upon tables of lessons, which as a teacher is great. Whereas in Rauworth, I have to kind of look, okay, here's what he has, and then I have to build lessons out of that. So having that Italian background really helps in doing that, because I can tailor certain lessons using just that material. But a lot of it comes down to the same.
Do we have any sources on Scottish swordsmanship, or do you need to infer it from English?
We do. But one of the things that's tricky with that is that, so there's McBain, Mathewson, Page, and a lot of these men, if they weren't Scottish themselves, like McBain was, had some firsthand knowledge of seeing the Scots fight. But, you know, like Highland Scotland didn't write any of this stuff down. It was a folk system, you know. They didn't have, if they did have manuals, we've lost them, and I haven't seen the reference to any. I think honestly, and I'm not the first person to say this, I think Paul Wagner was the first that said it to Mike, but he sees parallels between Highland Georgia and Highland Scotland in terms of terrain, in terms of weapon styles, and also probably in terms of instruction. So I'd love to follow that up more. I haven't had a chance to do it. So we do have some late period text. There's William Hope, who's Scottish, McBain, Sinclair, Mathewson. But a lot of that, and this is where I think it gets tricky. If you compare their sources with the English sources for the same weapon, there's not much difference. And that's one reason I prefer to call it insular, you know, island broadsword, because how much is Scottish, how much is English, I'm not really sure we can always tell. And we don't have anything to place it against. I mean, there's a couple drawings that people have made, but then there are issues with using those. There are descriptions, but how can you build a system from that? I don't know if you can, you know, and so I think we get a sense of what it was probably like without really knowing. But I mean, there's a lot of inference. Yeah.
As you know, for example, we have it also in Germany, or it's not only Germany, in many HEMA circles in Europe, but people are reviving Viking swordsmanship.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
I do.
Based on some, right, you know what I mean?
I think it's a similar problem. At least if you're looking for purely Scottish sources, say, that are like perfect for 1700 or 1650, I don't think we haven't found them. So there's a lot that I think people supply from the British manuals and kind of see this sort of, you know, pan-island system. And to some degree, that's probably fair. You know, these were all in the same network of places. These are two people that fought against each other quite a bit. And I know for like my own family, I've got a painting in the family of one of my my father's family, who was one of the Scots that joined an ethnic unit and fought for the British after Culloden. And so, you know, I know there was crossover, but at the same time, without having like a Highland book on how to do this, I think there's a lot of guesswork, and it's I think even worse for people doing Viking. Not that you can't, right? You could get some sense. Shields only work so many ways, but to be able to say, you know, this is purely Viking, you know, which period, which area, what time, what context? It's interesting experimental archaeology, but I get when people start talking about it as a system and something that they can like share and give out, I get kind of uncomfortable. I don't know how we do that.
You teach then the backsword or broadswords? I mean, Scottish broadsword, and is the same as English backsword, or could you help me?
Yeah, so the only real difference is broadsword has a sharper false edge.
Oh, okay.
So like if this is a trainer made by Castile, it's very basic, but the broadsword would be sharp, not so much here, but from here up on both sides. And the backsword is only sharp on the true edge. And a lot of those manuals, they cover a variety of cutting weapons. There's broadsword, backsword, sometimes called a shearing sword, I think, or that maybe people argue about that. And then, of course, everyone's favorite topic nowadays, spadroon, is in a lot of these as well, which is kind of like a marriage between a cutting and it's just a cut and thrust sword. So there's a lot of different things in there. And even with a backsword, sometimes that back third, right, would still be sharp. So a lot of the moves are the same. Yeah.
Do you also okay? What kind of other weapons do you teach? Do you teach like any dagger knife system as well?
No, I mean I've studied a little bit, obviously from Fiore. I've studied a little bit of Marazzo, but yeah, everything I do is about 2 to 3 feet. I don't do much with knives. Yeah, down the road, hopefully. You know, I still, like Mike's been teaching me a little bit from the Georgian and with Fiore, and then the broadsword group I'm working with right now, a lot of them have done Fiore as well, and they're working a lot on wrestling and dagger right now, and showed me some really great stuff last weekend. So down the road, yeah, when people are interested, I usually just send them to Mike.
So,
yeah.
And then my next question would be about unarmed combat. You know, just like with your hands and feet. Do you also teach that in your school?
A little bit. Normally, as it's kind of, how do I think of this? So if I'm teaching like a seminar, for example, a lot of what we do is going to be blade in hand, and that's very introductory. But then sometimes I'll throw in what they call the grips or grappling and disarms, because people enjoy that. But more formally, I do teach those, especially for saber and small sword, because there are a lot of really interesting disarms that you can learn to do. Now they would be, of course, frowned on in most competitions, historical or Olympic, but they're good to know. And knowing the counters to those are also useful. So it's very limited grappling, very limited empty hand.
Any other weapon you teach in your school, Jim?
No, it's really just saber, spada or epee, small sword, broadsword, and bayonet. Okay. So very modern in many ways.
Okay, could you please tell us about saber? Imagine someone comes to you, wants to learn saber. What's the most important thing the person should learn about saber fencing?
Oh gosh, footwork.
Oh, footwork. Why?
Yeah,
Why, Jim?
Well, I think because good footwork is the foundation for any martial art, right? You have to know how to move, and then it has to be fluid. It has to be very natural. And the way we move in saber is very unnatural. And so, you've got one foot pointed at your lead foot pointed at your opponent. The other one is about 90 degrees, just a little bit shallower. Your legs are bent. In the system I normally teach, the Italian system, our weight's kind of equally distributed. For the back sword and earlier stuff, it's often on the back leg. So getting used to moving that way, especially on different terrain, is difficult. And then there are sort of offline steps. They're traversing, cross steps. The other thing that's important about that is that there's I think, at least the way I teach it, if you're going to use measure well, you have to have good footwork. You have to know how to get in and out and manipulate that space effectively. But that also affects timing. And so if you're going to, attack in one tempo or two tempo, if you're going to try to set somebody up to fall short, so that's all things that we do primarily through our feet. So I start with that. That's the first thing we do. And then I almost always have them more a direct thrust from this line straight out. Partly because keeps them the furthest away from the opponent. But retreating under that also keeps them slightly safer. And then we work into the cuts. And after a while, after all those like nuts and bolts are there, we can start putting them together in different ways.
Does your saber system involve more cutting or thrusting?
Mostly cutting, but unlike a lot of systems, it does have a lot more thrusting. The Italian system has just a lot more of it. And I think it's an advantage, to be honest, depending on how the judges, of course, in the competition will look at it, which is a different question. The ability to make the choice for a thrust or a cut, to actually have the option is it makes you more versatile. And never, from a martial arts perspective, that thrust is often going to be more telling than a cut. And a number of sources from Poland to Italy, you read about like with dueling, sabers were considered a little safer because you could get a pretty nasty cut and probably walk away, get it sewed up, right? But a thrust through the chest before penicillin, before we understood what would happen with, dirty cloth was pushed into a wound, that could be pretty lethal. And so having that thrust in the mix, I think, is vital.
Yeah. Very good. And do you spar in historical fencing mask and fencing equipment?
Yes. So with beginners, a lot of things are done very slow. But for my more advanced students, especially one-on-one, we'll start out with some drills to warm up, but then it's basically a teaching bout. So I'll give them a problem and then I'll present something. Like, so for example, just last week, I had a student and we were working on a particular kind of thing where you sort of take control of the blade and then sort of disarm them a bit and cut. And so I set up options for him in real time. And, these things aren't super heavy, but they still pack a wallop, and safety is important. As I always tell students, like, look, I know the mask is uncomfortable, especially with the COVID mask underneath, but if we hurt our friends, we can't fence with them anymore. So we all have to stay safe and we can keep playing.
Now I'm going to open the Pandora's box. With a sharp sword, do you edge parry or do you flat parry?
Well, in my system, sharp. And partly for that is that, like on this saber, for example, and this I really only come to appreciate in more recent years, this part of the blade, the forte, would not be sharp. And so, it would be very much like it is right now. And this is actually rather thin, but from here down, it's sharp. And so our parrying system attempts to parry with the lower part of the blade for mechanical advantage. So I don't have any problem taking that on there at all. Now, for other swords that don't do that as much, I don't know to what degree medieval swords were sharp all the way down. I know some of them were, but I'm not convinced that all of the long swords, for example, were sharp down there. Maybe they were. But I can think of, like, with some of the things that I've seen in manuscripts, it would make more sense to have that sharp edge, say, from the middle up, and then the forte, the bottom part closest to the hands, just because there are different things that you can do by holding that section of the blade. Yeah. So I think, I'd say take it on the edge. But I know not everyone believes that.
Because it's more stable on your wrist, am I correct?
Yeah, because I think, especially like with these sabers, my thumb is on this back strap. And so if something strikes here, I have my thumb to push back against it. Whereas if I have it here, it can more easily flop back and I have to hold it at an angle to prevent that. Both work. There are sabers that do both kinds of things. Like with this weapon, for example, I can't put my thumb on there. It's too small. I can only put my fist in there. And so this, if somebody's coming really fast, I'll angle it so that it will go into the guard, and I maintain control of it. Yeah, I think it varies by weapon, definitely.
Jim, what is your opinion recently in Europe? Well, it's not only recently; it has been for a couple of years. I mean, actually, it's not sparring. It's a very controlled way they do. They call it sparring, but it's not sparring. They do it in a very controlled way with sharp swords because they say it gives you understanding of the sharps. So no mask, nothing, only with the sharp. And then it's very controlled. They call it sparring, but it is actually, we both know, this is not sparring, right? What is your opinion about this, to do it with sharps? It's actually playing around, right? I mean, they call it sparring with sharps, but they play around with it. But we all know that.
I feel, I think I understand, the desire, like when I think about, one of the people that I think does this best is Roland Warcheka, right? Very controlled. And I think he's very skilled, but I wonder what the conversion is from moving at that speed with a sharp. Sure, you're going to understand how blades stick, right? That I get that. That makes sense. But by definition, you're limited into what you can do because they're sharp and because they're not wearing gear. Even if they were wearing gear, they're still sharp. And I think for me, I can only tell you how I look at it. When I play with anything sharp, it's usually against fruit. Like after Halloween, my boys and I go in the backyard, we take pumpkins, we cut them up, and then we cook them. And I think that's useful, right? Because one, it's fun. It's a good way to teach safety. But for me, it's really just making sure the edge alignment's good. So when I hit the pumpkin or, cantaloupe, I look and I'm like, ooh, that one dished. And so I work a little harder on my technique. I don't play with sharps otherwise. They don't really have a role. And my philosophy is that we have to accept in historical martial arts that as realistic as we want to be, as historical as we want to be, and I hate to use this word, but I hear it all the time in the US, as martial as we want to be, we're still doing this safely. We never enter into a lesson or a tournament with any real sense of fear. We have nerves, maybe. How will I do? Will I win? Will I lose? Will I look silly? But we're not concerned about, will I lose function in a limb? Will I receive a thrust through the eye? And that changes everything. And so, I can understand how people would want to play with sharps to try to capture that, but it won't work because the intent isn't the same, right? Roland doesn't want to hurt any of those people. They try very hard not to. But if somebody has a sharp weapon and they want to hurt you, it's a different mindset and your reaction is going to be different. So while I think you can gain an appreciation for how a sharp sword feels, beyond that, I think what we do is very artificial, whether we like it or not. And so we just have to be very mindful of that fact and train accordingly. It's like, well, if this was sharp, would this work? And hopefully none of us ever find out. I know that there are some, I don't know what to say, individuals out there who have done this, but I think it's, insane. I don't know why they would do this. Even if you have free medical, it can ruin your week. I type for a living. I can't get cut.
I'll come back to your statement, and you said you do not like it to be called martial, and you have problems with that. Excuse me, I stand correct. Yeah. What kind of problems do you have with this adjective, martial, in English?
Well, in the US anyway, they use it for everything, and I don't think they use it appropriately. If you look up a dictionary definition, it's relating to martial arts or warfare, and that's fine. But I've heard things like, that blow's not martial. Well, it's with a blunt, right? So let's start there. But, the fact of the matter is, and this is what I don't understand. Now, maybe it's just me, but I've cut myself in a kitchen. I've cut myself in a wood shop. I was fixing a window once that was very old, and my weight shifted, and I put my hand through the window. I didn't even feel it, but it ripped me up pretty good, right? If you've ever had a bad cut and you've realized how little force it takes to do that, it doesn't take a whole lot. Like this is this is what, about 2.5 pounds. If this were sharp and I really wanted to hit somebody with it, that's going to hurt. I don't have to hit them like I would with a bat, right? The mechanics of the weapon are going to do that for me, assuming I know those mechanics and use them well.